Hey guys, and welcome back to Gap Grace Point Online, Grace Point's grade 4 to 6 online ministry. Today we carry on with our Power of 3 series. Now this series is so cool because the number 3 in the Bible is used over 300, I think even 400 times. It's used so many times through the Bible, and every time it's used by God as a kind of wake-up call for us. Hey, people, this is important. Look, the number 3 is here. Take note. The number 3 in the Bible shows us completion, perfection, and the power and growth. And so throughout this series, we're looking at the significance of the number 3 in the Bible. Now, if the Bible were to be a comic book, every time the number 3 was used, the word power would be next to it to show power. Look, this is important. And so today's lesson is called The Mystery of 3. Now, a mystery is something that cannot be explained. It's almost like a secret that continues to remain a kind of secret, yet we kind of get to understand it, but we never fully understand it. And so today's lesson is kind of the same. Today we look at 3 people, 3 men and 3 women. Oh wait, that's 6. So 3 men and 3 women that God uses throughout the Bible. And it's a mystery why God uses those specific 3 people. But God uses them, and He does something important through them into the lives of others and in their own lives. God uses them to change the course of Christian history forever. But before we get into our lesson today, we need to acknowledge something really important that happened in South Africa this week. On the 21st of March, we celebrate something in South Africa called Human Rights Day. And this is the day where we look at our rights. We look back at our history. We acknowledge the past, and we look forward to the future. On this day, we also like to look at the fact that men and women have equal human rights. And so, through this lesson today, God also shows us this, because God chose to use both men and women. He could have just used men, or He could have just used women, but God used men and women, because both are important in His kingdom. And so let's get into our lesson for today. And so for today's lesson, we're looking at the 3 important men and the 3 important women. First, let's look at the men. We have Abraham. Now, Abraham is a man that we find in the book of Genesis. Initially, his name was Abram, and then God later renames him to Abraham. But before we get to that, we need to know his story. Now, Abram was told by God one day that he should leave his father's house, and he should leave his family and leave his country and go somewhere where God would send him. God was actually saying to him, leave everything you know and trust me, and go with me, and I will reward you. God then says to him, I will reward you if you're faithful to me, and I will make you the father of all nations, and I will make your descendants great, and I will make you famous. And so God makes that promise to Abraham. And then Abraham follows God through this. What ends up happening is that God takes Abram, later called Abraham, and fulfills his promise. He makes a special promise with Abraham called a covenant, saying that God would be their God, and that all Abraham's descendants would be known as God's people. They would become God's beloved people, the people that God had set apart to be the ones who would follow Him. And in all this, God also promised to Abraham that he would become the father of all nations. Now, this sounds a little strange, but you have to understand the context behind it. Abraham and his wife Sarah could not have children, and so this was another trust factor for Abraham. God said, trust me, and I will make you the father of all nations. And Abraham and Sarah trusted them. Although it sounded a little bit ridiculous, they trusted God, and it came true. They had a miracle son called Isaac. We'll talk about him now. But all you need to know for now is that God used Abraham and did something special through him. Do you see how important Abraham was? God used Abraham to lead God's people in their faith, and to help them remember that they would always be God's people and He would always be their God. Our second man for today is Isaac. Isaac is the miracle son of Abraham and Sarah. Remember how we said that Abraham and Sarah wouldn't be able to have kids? Well, God promised them they would, and He followed through in this promise. Isaac is important on God's journey because God, through Isaac, tests Abraham's faith and the people of God, tests their faith through Isaac, and reminds them to trust God in all the situations. And remember the covenant, that special promise that God made with His people. I will be your God, and you will be my people. Isaac also carries out this promise with God, and God reminds him through the story of Abraham and Isaac that he will always keep his promises. And this applies to us as well. Number 3, we have Jacob. Now, Jacob is one of Isaac's sons. So we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Isaac had twin sons. They were called Jacob and Esau. Now, Esau was actually the older one, which means that he got special rights and privileges, and he should have gotten this special kind of inheritance. But Jacob was a deceiver from the start. In fact, his name, Jacob, means deceiver. When the time came for Isaac to bless Esau, Jacob then tricks his father by pretending to be his brother. He then gets the blessing and steals it, and Esau is really upset. I don't blame him, do you? And so Jacob then gets scared and runs away because of his sins against his brother. So he runs away, and a lot happens to him after this. But God is always with him and with us, even when we make mistakes. These are the people that God decided should be our forefathers of Christianity: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God then later goes on to change Jacob's name to Israel, because from Jacob, the nation of Israel, God's chosen people, continue and carry on, and God continues his faithful promise through these people. Israel is a really important part of the history of God and our Christian history. And so God used these 3 people in order to start off our Christian history. Remember how I said it's a mystery? We don't necessarily understand why God used those people. Why specifically those 3 guys? And why those guys? But we need to trust that God knew what he was doing. He had a plan, and that's why he chose them. God used them for a specific purpose. And now we look at the 3 women. This part is a little bit more tricky, because the Bible is not 100% sure exactly who those 3 women were. You see, we spoke about human rights in the beginning, and back in those days, women did not have the same rights as men. A woman wasn't allowed to speak in public. There were certain things she wasn't allowed to wear, or certain things she had to wear because of it. You know when in court, someone gives their story or their testimony or they present their witness? Well, back in those times, women couldn't even do that. Their story wasn't accepted in the court. It wouldn't change the outcome of the case. And so women didn't even have those rights. They had no rights in those days and weren't regarded as important. Yet, God chooses those 3 women to reveal his mystery, his plan through. Those 3 women were the first people that found Jesus' tomb empty on the day that he was raised from the dead. They found the tomb empty and knew that Jesus had been raised from the dead. God decided to use women for some reason. It's a mystery why he used them. Not that there's anything wrong with men or women, but God had a special plan using those 3 women. And so, although we don't always understand it, God has a special plan. And so, why is this important? How do we apply this to our lives? Today's lesson helps us understand the mystery in the way that God works. You see, sometimes we don't get it. We don't understand why God works, but we need to trust God and believe that he knows what's happening and why things are happening the way they are. It's a mystery why God chose 3 men and 3 women. Each of them had equally important parts, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. They both played a role in the beginning of our Christian history and the end of our history. Without them, our Christian history wouldn't be the same. Without the 3 men, we wouldn't have the lineage of David. And without the 3 women, we probably wouldn't know the story of Jesus' resurrection. Both of them were just as important. And so here's the important part. God could have chosen only men or only women, yet he decides to choose both. This tells us something about God's heart and how he feels about men and women. We're both important and both special. So, how can we apply this to our own lives? Firstly, we need to treat all people with love, compassion, and kindness, regarding if they're men and women, black or white, pink, purple, green, blue, whatever. But we should love them, have compassion, and be kind to them, regardless of who they are, because God has a special plan for each person. Number 2, God has a special plan for us. and for every single person on this earth. No matter if we've done a lot of bad things or even a lot of good things, God has a plan. He knows what He's doing, and He likes to include us in His mysterious plan in the way He chooses to use us. Number 3, be ready for God to use you in His mysterious plan. Remember how we said mystery is kind of like a secret which we begin to understand but will never completely understand. Well, God's plan is just like that. We understand some of it, but God is so much bigger and so much more complex than we can ever understand. Yet, God decides to use us in the way He wills. And so we need to be available and ready for God to use us. Jesus' life, death, and resurrection was just as much of a mystery to people in those days. And it still is a mystery to us today. Yet, it was all part of God's great big plan. And so Jesus also had to trust God. And we should trust God in this plan, this history, this mystery, in the same way as Jesus did. Today's memory verse comes from Psalm 25, verse 14, in the International Children's Bible. The Lord tells His secrets to those who respect Him. He tells them about His agreement. When we trust God, He will let us in on His secret and be part of His mysterious plan. There's a fun activity for you today in our comments below. Click on the link and it will take you to our website where our resources are uploaded. Click on it and do the activity and see how much you remember about today's lesson. That's it for us today from Gap Gracebond Online. But remember to join us next week for our episode 5 of the Power of 3 series. Bye guys, see you next week.